January 1944. London, England. Lieutenant Colonel Roger Hesketh sat in his cramped office in Storey's Gate and reviewed the files that contained the identities of every German spy operating in Great Britain. There were 27 of them. Hesketh knew their names, their cover identities, their handlers in the German Abwehr intelligence service, their communication schedules, and the specific information each one had been recruited to obtain. He knew all of this because British intelligence had captured every single German agent who had been sent to Britain since the beginning of the war, and had given each one a choice: work for us or be hanged as a spy. All 27 had chosen to work for British intelligence. They were now what MI5 called double agents, men and women who continued to communicate with their German handlers as if they were loyal German spies, transmitting information that British intelligence carefully crafted to be believable, occasionally accurate on minor points, and systematically deceptive on the questions that mattered most. Hesketh was the chief architect of Operation Fortitude, the deception operation that was designed to make Adolf Hitler believe something that would determine the outcome of the most critical military operation of the war. He needed Hitler to believe that the main Allied invasion of Western Europe would land at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrow strait between England and France where the channel was only 21 miles wide, and that any landing elsewhere was a diversion designed to draw German forces away from the real attack. If Hitler believed this, he would keep the powerful German 15th Army at the Pas-de-Calais waiting for the main invasion, even after Allied forces landed in Normandy. The 15th Army would sit 20 miles away from the Normandy beaches, watching and waiting for an attack that would never come, while the real invasion force established itself and became strong enough to withstand the German counterattack that would eventually come. If Hitler did not believe this, the 15th Army would move to Normandy, and the Allied invasion force that was fighting to establish itself on the beaches would face an additional German army before it was strong enough to stop it. The difference between those two outcomes was probably the difference between the liberation of Europe and a catastrophe that would have added years to the war and millions to its death toll. Hesketh had 27 double agents and the most sophisticated deception operation in the history of warfare to make Hitler believe the lie. He was going to need all of it. The deception that Hesketh was managing was the culmination of years of work by British intelligence that had begun almost accidentally in the first months of the war. The German Abwehr had sent agents to Britain with the expectation that they would establish themselves, recruit local sources, and begin providing intelligence on British military preparations. What the Abwehr had not anticipated was that British counterintelligence was capable enough to identify and capture every agent it sent. The double-cross system, as British intelligence called it, had been running since 1940. The 27 agents who were now providing carefully crafted misinformation to their German handlers had been doing so for years, building credibility with their German controllers by providing accurate information on minor matters and false information on major ones. The most important of these agents was a man known by the code name Garbo. Juan Pujol García was a Spanish citizen who had approached British intelligence in 1941 with an offer to work as a spy. His motivation was straightforward and genuine. He hated the Nazis and wanted to do whatever he could to help defeat them. British intelligence's initial assessment of him was skeptical, and they declined his offer. Pujol then did something extraordinary. He went to the German intelligence service, convinced them that he was a committed Nazi sympathizer, and offered to spy for Germany. The Germans accepted. They gave him money, a radio, and instructions to travel to England and begin gathering intelligence. Pujol never went to England. He went to Lisbon, where he spent months inventing a network of fictional subagents and sending their fabricated reports to his German handlers from information available in libraries and tourist guides. The Germans believed they had an agent with a productive network in England. They actually had a man in a Lisbon apartment making things up. When British intelligence discovered what Pujol was doing, they immediately recognized his potential and brought him to London. Under the control of MI5, Pujol expanded his fictional network, created additional fictional subagents with detailed backstories, and built a communications relationship with his German handlers that was so convincing and so valuable to them that the Germans awarded him the Iron Cross for his work. It was the Iron Cross, given by Germany to a man who was systematically lying to them. Garbo was the centerpiece of Operation Fortitude, but he was one of 27 agents, each one contributing a different thread to the tapestry of deception that Hesketh was weaving. The collective picture that these agents painted for German intelligence was specific and detailed. There was a massive Allied army in southeast England, designated the 1st United States Army Group, commanded by General George Patton, the German General Staff's most feared American commander. This army was positioned and equipped for a cross-channel assault at the Pas-de-Calais. The forces in southwest England preparing for the actual Normandy landing were a smaller secondary force. To make this picture convincing, The deception required more than the reports of double agents. It required physical evidence that German aerial reconnaissance could photograph and that German intelligence could use to verify the agent's reports. The deception planners created that evidence with an industrial thoroughness that was itself a remarkable achievement. Inflatable tanks were positioned in fields across southeast England, visible from the air, consistent with the presence of an armoured force preparing for assault. Fake oil storage facilities were constructed near Dover. Fake landing craft were assembled in the Thames estuary. Fake radio traffic was generated at a volume and pattern consistent with an army headquarters preparing for a major operation. The radio traffic was perhaps the most important element after the double agents themselves. German signals intelligence monitored Allied radio communications continuously, and the volume and pattern of radio traffic was one of the most reliable indicators of military activity. The deception planners generated the radio traffic of an entire army group from southeast England, with the communications patterns that the German analysts had learned to associate with formations of specific sizes making specific preparations. General Patton's involvement was both genuine and carefully managed. Patton was in England, visibly travelling between military installations in southeast England, being seen at functions where German intelligence could confirm his presence. His reputation was so formidable among German military planners that his association with FUSAG, the fictional First United States Army Group, added an authenticity to the deception that no fabricated report could have provided. Hitler's assessment of Patton as the most dangerous American general was itself a product of accurate intelligence. Patton was the most dangerous American general. The German decision to assign him as commander of the Normandy diversion rather than the real assault reflected a misunderstanding of how the Allies were using their most capable commander, not of Patton's capabilities. The Germans had been told the truth about Patton. They had been lied to about what he was doing. As June 6, 1944 approached, Hesketh's team made increasingly specific preparations. The double agents' communications were timed and calibrated to build toward a specific moment, the moment when the Normandy landing would happen and the Germans would need to decide whether it was the main invasion or the diversion they had been prepared to expect. The Germans had also received intelligence from legitimate sources that pointed toward Normandy as a possible landing site. French resistance reports, aerial reconnaissance, and the assessment of Field Marshal Rommel, who commanded the German forces in France, had identified Normandy as a serious threat. Hitler himself had expressed concern about Normandy in the months before D-Day. The deception did not need to eliminate German concern about Normandy. It needed to maintain German uncertainty about whether Normandy was the main effort or a feint, and to ensure that when the Normandy landing occurred the German response would be cautious and delayed rather than immediate and decisive. This is what Garbo's most important communication accomplished. On the night of June 5 to June 6, as the Allied fleet was crossing the Channel and the paratroopers were jumping in the darkness, Garbo attempted to warn his German handlers that the Normandy invasion was about to begin. He could not reach them. The radio schedule did not work. His message was not received until the landing was already underway. The failure was deliberate. If Garbo had warned the Germans before the landing, the Germans would have had time to respond before the beaches were secured. The failed warning was designed to accomplish something different. It was designed to establish Garbo's credibility for the communication that would come 3 days after the landing, and that would be the most important message in the history of the double-cross system. On June 9, 1944, 3 days after D-Day, Garbo sent a message to his German handlers that has been described by historians as the most important message of the Second World War. The message, which his handlers passed directly to Hitler's headquarters, reported that the Normandy landing was not the main Allied invasion. The real invasion was still coming. Patton's army at the Pas-de-Calais was preparing to strike. The Normandy forces were a feint to draw German reserves away from the main attack. Garbo's message was believed. Hitler, who had been on the verge of ordering the 15th Army to move to Normandy, cancelled the order. The tanks and the infantry that might have driven the Allied forces off the beaches on June 9 stayed at the Pas-de-Calais waiting for the main invasion that was never going to come. They waited for 7 weeks. By the time the German command finally accepted that the Pas-de-Calais attack was not coming, the Allied beachhead in Normandy was too strong to be dislodged. Patton's real army, the Third Army, broke out from Normandy in late July and swept across France with the speed that had made his name the most feared in the German General Staff. The deception had worked. Not perfectly, and not without complications and near failures, but in the fundamental sense that it had preserved the Allied advantage at the most critical moment. The D-Day landings had succeeded, at great cost in lives, because the German forces that might have stopped them were somewhere else. They were somewhere else because 27 double agents and a fictional army group and a Spanish man in a London apartment had spent months convincing Hitler that the real invasion was coming somewhere it was not. The Germans discovered the truth gradually, as the weeks passed and Patton's army appeared in France doing things that the 15th Army at the Pas-de-Calais should have been doing, and as the invasion force that was supposed to be the diversion kept getting stronger rather than collapsing as a diversion should collapse. The German assessment of Operation Fortitude, when the deception was finally understood, was conducted with the professional respect that the German military intelligence establishment gave to operations that had defeated it. The Abwehr, whose agents had all been turned without its knowledge, had been the primary instrument of its own defeat. The reports that its agents had been sending for years, reports that had been used to validate strategic decisions at the highest level of German command, had been fabrications designed by the people they were supposed to be spying on. General Walter Schellenberg, who headed German foreign intelligence, wrote after the war that Fortitude was the most successful deception operation of the war and that the German intelligence system's failure to detect it was the most consequential intelligence failure in history. He was right about both assessments. Juan Pujol García, whose fictional network had been the centerpiece of the deception, received both the Iron Cross from Germany and the MBE from Britain, making him the only person in history to receive military honors from both sides of a conflict in which he had served. He was awarded the MBE personally by King George VI. He had earned both. The Iron Cross for the performance that convinced the Germans he was their most valuable agent in Britain. The MBE for using that performance to help win the war. The men and women of British intelligence who built and ran Operation Fortitude did not receive public recognition for decades. The operation remained classified until the 1970s. The double agents who had risked their lives transmitting deceptive intelligence to German handlers lived with the knowledge of what they had done in private for years before the official acknowledgement came. What they had done was win the most important intelligence battle of the war, the battle to determine where Hitler's reserves would be on June 6 and June 9, 1944. They had won it with fabricated armies and inflatable tanks and a network of agents that existed partly in reality and partly in the imagination of a Spanish man who had never been to England when he started inventing reports about it. They had won it because they were better at the game than the Germans, because the German intelligence system that had served the Reich throughout its expansion had been comprehensively penetrated and turned into an instrument of its own destruction. The greatest weapon in Operation Overlord was not the bombers or the battleships or the 10,000 aircraft or the 150,000 men who crossed the Channel on June 6. The greatest weapon was the lie that kept 23 German divisions sitting at the Pas-de-Calais waiting for an invasion that was never coming, watching the Real invasion succeed 20 miles away, unable to respond because their Führer had been told by his most trusted intelligence sources that what was happening in Normandy was a trick. It was not a trick. It was the liberation of Western Europe. But the trick that made it possible was the greatest deception in the history of warfare. And it worked.